Well, welcome back, everybody, to Legacy Builders Podcast. We have a really, really great episode today. Three remarkable women, and Madison is really connected with and got to know. And we have some great topics today to discuss. And Madison, tell me about our guests.
Yes. So, okay. All of these three amazing women are dear friends of mine. And I was telling one of them the other day, just like, it's kind of nerve-wracking to introduce them because there's just so many great things about them. And so I'm going to start with Makiah. Makiah is a singer and songwriter and has amazing music out there. She's also like really got that entrepreneur spirit and is also an amazing worship leader. So she has done some incredible things and just has incredible music out there. And at the end, we're going to link all of their awesomeness, like, and all of where you can find them below. So, but yeah, Lindsay or Kendra, do you have anything to say about Makiah?
Makiah is just such a sweet friend, first of all, but such a talented singer, songwriter, and I just love listening to her music.
So good.
I'm gonna promo Makiah's sticker, Unfiltered Me. Go check out the song. But what I'd love to say about Makiah is that anytime I hear her worship, she just has a really prophetic gifting and calling on her life. And so it's just been amazing to be her friend and just to experience God through her and her worship.
Yeah. So as you can see, we're all kind of connected and friends as well. And so we wanted to have everybody kind of introduced and everything. But next is Kendra, and Kendra has created this social media, just awesome page where she's an artist. She's also an entrepreneur and has like an Etsy shop and so many amazing stickers. And she just released her fall collection, which is so cute. And has a Marvel collection, which is really cool as well. But yeah, she's got over 20,000 followers and she's doing amazing stuff. And so Makiah, Lindsay, what else do you got to say about Kendra?
Yes. I have to show off
stickers. No, show the stickers.
Yeah, I'll show.
I don't have any.
Enneagram 2. And
oh yes, and she's an Enneagram expert pretty much.
There he is, great.
I have those same stickers on my laptop, which I can't show because I'm using right now, but I get so many questions all the time. So I'm constantly plugging, go to her Etsy, get all the stickers. You need them in your life. So
yes, 100%. And then Lindsay has been through some really tough stuff in her life and has just really conquered that. And she wrote a book about it. And so Lindsay over here is an author, she's a speaker, and she just pours into so many women's life and is just really, she's amazing and she inspires me. And yeah, there's not enough good things I could say about Lindsay. So Kendra and Makiah, you got anything to add?
Yeah. So one of my favorite things about Lindsay is first of all, she's an amazing friend, but also, you know how some people, you have stuff that you're like, oh, my friend did this, so I should promote it, but like, it's not actually that good. That's like not the situation. I give Lindsay's book to everyone. It comes up in so many conversations, especially with like young women who are going through like a lot of just like mental health or maybe some different struggles that I can also relate to as well. Power of Choice. It's a banger. It's definitely something that every young woman needs in their life. It's so full of just faith and full of really good principles, like similar to what we do on this podcast. So if you're listening to this podcast, you really need to get the book. That's all I'm saying.
Kendra, what about you?
Yeah, and I mean, really in the same vein, I cannot tell you how many people that I have like not even just recommended Lindsay's book to, but been like, no, buy it now. It is great. Anytime. Yeah, it's definitely a go-to resource. And she's just such a sweet friend. We also work together, and anytime you're calling each other back and forth, it's always just brightens my day just a little bit just to talk to Lindsay. Even if it's about work stuff, you can hear the smile through her voice. You can just always get that encouragement from her. So she's wonderful.
Yeah. And that's how I feel about all of y'all's stuff is buy the music, listen to Makiah's music, buy the stickers, follow Kendra, and buy the book. And so you guys have just done some incredible things and you all inspire me a lot. And so I'm excited to just kind of dive into this conversation with you. And I'm going to let my dad preface it a little bit because we are probably going to dive into a couple things that are a little bit sensitive and vulnerable. And I'm grateful that you guys would be willing to share your stories and perspectives on those as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So as we're developing legacy builders, we're Madison and I, who we have lots of conversation, and we're in a situation that I've decided to intentionally start to build legacy, and it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do, and it's not common. It's not like every parent is out there saying, "I need to build this thing called legacy." We're just kind of coining that term, and we even talk about many times how we're building legacy whether we know it or not. So parents, if you're listening, you're teaching your children something, whether good or bad. So you are imparting things into your children, both positive and negative. Whether you are intentionally building legacy, that's just a byproduct of they're observing you as they're growing up, and sometimes there's a disconnect. And part of the things that Madison and I talk about is we realize that there are challenges in families and relationships, and we want to talk about those things because we feel that people need to hear about them. We feel that parents need to understand what their children want and are desiring, but sometimes there's a disconnect, and I want to be a voice to parents to be like, hey, listen, we need to listen to our children because they desire certain things. And so Madison was just talking about you all and some of the challenges and the disconnects that you had. And I'm thankful that you are willing to be a voice for this younger generation and to share stories. This obviously will not be the first time we have you all on, but as it pertains to legacy and this disconnect in legacy, I'll have Madison kind of narrate and kind of ask the questions regarding that. But I just wanted to kind of set the stage. Parents, if you're watching this podcast, please listen to what your children, and I say children lightly because you guys are not young. You're going to tell stories of your perspectives as children growing up, and so you're definitely beyond that and have overcome some of those disconnects, but it doesn't change the desire. And so that's kind of what Madison kind of wanted to bring out and help hopefully make a difference in parents really listening to what children are desiring. So Madison?
Yeah. So to start, let's talk about this word legacy. Like, I'm curious if we call it legacy, but I'm curious if you've ever even thought about like legacy or what you would define that as. So Makiah, let's start with you and just, yeah.
Well, I definitely think growing up in a Christian home, one thing that we talked a lot about was the idea of like generational blessings, those kind of things. And so when I think of legacy, I really think about that generational piece, something that can be a good thing or a bad thing, whether there's generational things that are passed down that you have to conquer, or whether it's, things that just are part of your family and you kind of inherit. And so I think what's been cool, even listening to the podcast, and I just recently got married as well. So this idea of legacy, it's like real now for me, because before it was that I was just living in the part of the legacy I was given. Mm-hmm. And really my young kind of single years, it was figuring out, okay, this was what I was given. How do I change that legacy? Is this what I want? And then now my husband and I, it's really just this time of, we have no idea, like, what actually do we want that to be? Because we each come in with things from our family. So, that's kind of been my thought process with legacy and kind of what I'm just in the middle of right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, so what like kind of conversations, because like you said, with your husband and newlyweds out there, like, are you having those conversations about what you guys want and bring that in? Like, what does that look like, Makiah?
I think it's hard, honestly, because we do, but there's so much that you're learning so fast when you just get married. Like, you're like, I didn't even think about this. I wasn't I'm barely thinking a week ahead, and now all of a sudden you can kind of feel the weight of it, of like, what is this going to be like as we like grow in a family, and how we both do ministry together. So that's been a big piece. And I think really what it comes down to is, I think legacy is unique to each person in some ways. It's figuring out, okay, God, what have you called us to be? Because we're not our parents. You know, we want to take the good things from our parents. We want to sort through some of the challenges, but how do we look ahead and start doing right now? Because it's tempting to just focus on the now and not worry about like, oh, let's build up money for later, and let's, there's so many immediate needs. But I think that's been a challenge for us, is finding, where do we find that foundation, and how do we build it now into small things so that we are intentional going forward into like these bigger things. So definitely conversations that we're still having, still figuring out. Honestly, the podcast has been pretty helpful with that. So
Good. That's great. But yeah, that's so good. I mean, that's so good that you guys are even having those conversations. And so I love that. Kendra, what about you? What does like legacy mean to you? Growing up, what did you learn about legacy? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. When you guys have been talking about legacy, I've been thinking a lot about the word inheritance. And I can think back to growing up. One thing that my parents really instilled in me and my two siblings was, planning for the future financially, and being aware of, not living paycheck to paycheck was something that they just talked a lot about. And there's a privilege to that, of course. But my mom would tell me that, even right when her and my dad got married, right before they started having kids, they were planning, for college, and they were planning for whatever else could come up. And so when I hear legacy, I feel that same thing of, they were wanting to pass something down to us physically, but there's that same emotional, mental piece that comes into that just as they want to pass down good things to us physically, there's still those mental or emotional things that they are passing down that they just aren't aware of. And so for me, I would say legacy just is those things that, like you guys have said, the good and the bad that just get passed down. And in the same way that they've been intentional with other aspects of inheritance, parents need to be intentional with those emotional, mental things that they're passing down as well.
Yeah,
that's very well said.
Yes, so good. We actually talked about in a previous episode just how a lot of people set up and think legacy is just inheritance, but it's so much more than just that. And so you said that so well. Thank you for that. Yeah. And Lindsay, what about you? Like growing up, what did you think about legacy? What do you think when we say legacy now? And
yeah, so I would say legacy to me feels like a newer concept, maybe, that I've focused on over the last few years. Growing up, I think there was probably a sense of legacy, but that's not what I understood it as. As far as like in my childhood, my parents did talk a lot about how they wanted my sister and I to have different than what they had. And a lot of it did have to do with like financial aspects of it. To my dad, it was really important that we didn't have to work through college. He wanted us to be able to just get our education and not have that be a focus of, having to divide our time between work and school. So that's one example of what that looked like. But I would say now, what I love about legacy is I think it really does have like a past, a present, and a future aspect to it. The past is, what type of legacy has been left for me. The present, what am I doing now to create that legacy and that impact in the present and in the now, but setting myself up for the future. And then obviously in the future, how is that legacy going to impact other people? So I really do like that focus now. And I think why it's become a bigger focus over the last few years is, with part of my story, I struggled for most of my life with suicidal thoughts and attempts. And so legacy just really wasn't a concept because of that. I wasn't even really sure that there was going to be a legacy to be had. But I would say now one thing that maybe makes my situation or story a little unique is I don't have a husband, I don't have kids. And so I've really had to think through over the last few years, what does legacy look like when it's not with kids? And so one of the things that God showed me a couple years ago, because I love kids, I spend time with kids all the time. I know all you guys have seen that in different capacities. But God showed me that if I had kids of my own right now, I wouldn't be able to have an impact on as many kids as I'm able to right now. And so that's just one thing that's been really special for me to consider with legacy, is that it doesn't have to look like physical children or family that come after me. It can still be other people that are involved in my life that that I can leave that impact and that legacy for.
Yeah.
That's so well said also. And we've actually talked about that, with, what does it look like for single people, who maybe not even desire to have a family, you can still leave legacy. This is legacy right here. See, when whatever happens, this is going to stay for generations and generations and generations. So this legacy will continue to move on, and all the lives and the stories that you've impacted, this is legacy. I mean, it's a true example of legacy too. So it doesn't just have to be family. So you are building legacy right now with your stories and your, all the people's lives that you're impacting. So
Yeah. And that's just, I'm so grateful for you all to come on too, because all of you are at a different area of life and can speak to different people in different stages. And we really wanted that younger voice to be on here as well, and where it's not just about like parenting, or it's not just one generation speaking to another, but it's really combining those both generations and figuring out how we can move ahead better. And so one of the things that I've talked to you all about, like, and that you seem to have kind of in common, is this disconnect between that legacy growing up. And so you defined what legacy is to you. And now I'm just curious to, what was that disconnect growing up? Like, what are some of the things that you wish legacy was growing up, and that you wish were some of the things that they taught you to go out and be a little more prepared than where you're at right now? Lindsay, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I can definitely start. So I think with the disconnect is that there was a disconnect both like maybe with more like the emotional side of legacy, but also with like the practical side of legacy. And so one of the things that I've recognized over the last few years is, I mean, I'm an adult, I do adult things, but I think growing up, I was trained to be really dependent in relationships. And so I think it took me a lot longer maybe than others to really feel like I could adult and could pay bills and figure out, just what it looks like when you need a car repair or things like that. And so there was that disconnect of, I just didn't feel prepared to budget, to learn how to problem solve with things that I don't, have current knowledge for. So there was that aspect, but also on the emotional side, our family was very secretive, and it felt more like of a performance. And so I just didn't really feel like there was a positive legacy being built. It felt like anything that was there was more negative. And there were some good things, of course. It wasn't all negative, but that's just what I remember the majority of my childhood, or just the legacy being built. It was more on like the toxic side of things.
Yeah. And that's one of the things we really discussed, is legacy is a neutral word. Like, what you do and the actions you like take are what creates a good or a bad legacy. And so thank you for sharing that. But Kendra, what about you? Like, growing up, where was the disconnect in like legacy? Where's just the disconnect in family?
Yeah, for sure. I can look back and see a lot of the good things that were given to me, that were taught to me. I see that like work ethic and independence were something that were really pushed growing up. And when I just look back at all the times, especially like throughout high school, when I see that I got my first job, I was working at a restaurant when I was 14, and that was just kind of the expectation. And through that, I got all the validation of, you're such a hard worker and we're so proud of you, because I was working. And whenever I was having a hard time emotionally or mentally, or even just balancing work and school, those things were not, when I brought them up, they were not received with gentleness or support or care. It felt like as a child, it was always, well, you don't want to slack off. You want to keep working. You want to, we'll get through this, but like, make sure that grades stay high and paychecks come in is how it kind of felt. And I've always valued my independence. I moved out right when I turned 18 and got a job and was doing all that. But I realized now as I've grown up more, I just cannot, I have such a hard time being vulnerable with people, and especially with people in my family. And when I realized this, it's been something that I've wanted to try to work through with my parents, is just that ability to be vulnerable. And that's just been such a disconnect of like our value. It feels like our value, speaking for me and my siblings, has just always been what we achieve. And that value goes down when we're not achieving or when we're in a vulnerable spot. And yeah, so that would be a disconnect that I would say is kind of the biggest thing I've experienced.
Yeah. Lindsay, Makiah, do you have anything, like, I know you guys have talked about some of those shared stories. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I definitely relate to just a lot of that with Lindsay, especially I think the dependence thing. And I think there's something too about when, obviously I've never raised children, so that's not something I can speak to, but something about raising children to be children versus raising children to be adults. I feel like there was never the goal of setting me up in a way to leave, almost like a way to keep me and to let me thrive in an area as long as it felt, comfortable for my parents and stuff. And so that was difficult because it required just a lot of times of kind of like breaking out of that shell and trying to find ways to be independent. But also I definitely grew up in a family where it was very like high achievement. I have a family that has a lot of intelligence, which in some ways is legacy in itself, but really just focusing on education and even sometimes religion or spirituality, but really missing the idea of what are the emotional things, like how are we treating people, how are we actually I don't know, developing those interpersonal kind of things that we need. Does it matter how many relationships we have that are close? And so I definitely can relate to what both Lindsay and Kendra said. And I think it's a difficult thing. And I think some of it is the disconnect for me was there was an intentionality in certain areas of legacy. And then there was this complete unawareness in others. And if I have to look back at it, it's because that was never a legacy that was modeled for my parents. It really is
Right.
more than just generation to generation. And that's something I feel blessed in this way because I had to go through some of the things I went through, that I have that awareness even. So it's something that weighs pretty heavily on me because I know growing up, all the things that I wish I'd been more prepared to do to like handle myself emotionally or to make relationships or to know when to take breaks and to be okay and not always have to force myself to achieve. So that's just kind of my kind of, I don't know, how I saw legacy and how that disconnect happened for me growing up.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. And you had mentioned one thing, which is kind of part of my story, is you had mentioned that you saw that maybe that was what your parents were, how they were taught, right? And so we see this generational cycle that it's not just, okay, all of a sudden our parents were the ones that messed everything up. No, this is what was taught to them, which was taught to them. And so at some point we have to break that mold and we have to break that cycle. And if parents are listening, it would be better to not pretend you know it all, to be open and honest with your children and try to identify what their needs are in the moment. Don't try to be like you know everything, because we know you don't. And that's the big thing, is how does the child tell the parent, hey, I need this, and you think you know what they need, but it'd be better if you just ask them. And like Makiah had said, instead of teaching them to be children, teach them how to be adults. And that's one thing that Madison and I talk a lot about, is making sure that there's moments. Yes, I am the dad and I'm responsible and I'm the parent, but I'm not trying to live my life through her. I'm not trying to live my insecurities through her. And matter of fact, there's times where we're on an equal playing field. She has a right to come and challenge me, and a safety to come and challenge me on, question me on stuff. But we've established that because I have taken the time to read books, learn where my parents could take me. I knew I wanted to go to another level. So I had to find somebody that could teach me those gaps. And that's why we create this podcast, so that we can help teach parents how to bridge that gap. So thank you all so much for sharing so far what you've shared.
It's been really, really good. And just on that side of things where you just said an even playing field on some things, it definitely takes like two for the relationship. And so one of the things for the relationship, for the legacy, for that challenging, I mean, it takes the parent to be a little bit vulnerable with their kid and the kid to be responsive as well. And so talk to me a little bit about just the times, because you guys have talked about action steps that you've made kind of towards family and towards that, creating that deeper bond between them. What are some of the things that you tried that maybe didn't quite like reach them, or what are some of the things that, how are some of the responses that you wish they had? Kendra, if you want to start this one.
Yeah. When I kind of started realizing that, once I moved out on my own and started realizing that a relationship between me and my parents needs to evolve and needs to change into, just two adults, and not so much of a parent and a child. And I made that really a priority, that I wanted to try to cultivate that. And I was realizing that there was this barrier that we kept coming up against, where it was just, like, as I mentioned, just so hard for me to be vulnerable with them. I think back to a few years ago, I just walked through something just so difficult, something that I really needed their support in. And even bringing that up felt like a battle. And I see that the disconnect there, that is, when I try to bring up these barriers, they are rooted in things that happened in childhood. And my parents' response has always been, well, we did the best we could. And I validate that, and I know that that's true, and that, they did the best that they could with the resources they had, just like you guys have talked about what they learned from their parents. They've just moved that along. And so, especially with my mom, who she has been a stay-at-home mom ever since my older sister was born, and I still have a younger sibling who lives at home, so she's still doing that. When I would try to bring up these hurts, it wasn't just me talking about an experience that I had. To her, I was attacking something deeply personal to her, because this has been her life for 25 years. And it's not just me sharing something that I want to discuss, it's me like really hurting a part of her. And that's just been something I'm still trying to figure out how to communicate, that my parents doing the best that they could with the resources they have can be true, while also there were some things that hurt me and still affect me in my adult life that we need to discuss in order to move on. I think those things can both be true.
Right. Yeah. And so what does that look like, that conversation on your end? What do you wish it would look like do you wish they would just like listen to the full story before the response, or what does that look like to you?
I wish that there was a way I could communicate that, my mom's identity is not in being a mom. And I know, I'm sure she knows that, but there's just kind of an immediate defense. Like, as soon as I bring up anything from my childhood, it comes up like a wall comes up immediately. And it's just not something that we can discuss. And, I also acknowledge that I wasn't a great kid. I was a handful. I'm sure I was hard to parent. And I can acknowledge that as well, and be like, I know that I wasn't always great, but I was also the child. I feel like a big part of the conversation comes to, well, I was doing the best I could and you were a difficult child. Like, yeah, but I was also a child. And I just wish there wasn't so much defensiveness, and that we could just both be open and both, hurt together, that we can be together in this emotional way that isn't pointing the finger, trying to point blame, that we could both say like, we both were hurt and let's fix it.
Yeah, that's really good. Lindsay, I know for you, just, I mean, do you have anything to add to that piece of it? Do you have any of that conversation that you wish where you could have that, where you could sit down and have that deeper connection, like with your dad?
Yeah, I really do. And one thing I want to preface with too is forgiveness was a huge piece that I had to work through. And what we've already talked about on here with recognizing that a lot of times parent out of what they grew up with and what they knew, that was huge for me with the forgiveness piece. You know, it wasn't until probably my like mid-20s that I started to realize that, oh, my parents weren't intentionally trying to hurt or abuse me. I mean, there was obviously a choice in that, you know, they had a choice to do it or not, but it really was stemming from their own hurts and what they grew up with. And so for me, that was really big to recognize, because it helped empower me to learn forgiveness. And then once I learned that forgiveness was a choice and not a feeling, then I was able to put that into place. And so once I was able to forgive my dad specifically, I really did desire a relationship with him. And so that's one thing that I really wish he knew, is that that I did forgive him, and that I'm walking in forgiveness. But I think because what he grew up with has really placed, I think, perfectionism over his life. I don't know that he's even able to admit that there's fault on his end. And I think why that's important is a couple years ago, I did have to cut off relationship with him. And it was really because I didn't feel like he was allowing me to live my life. And even though I was an adult and he lived states away, there was still aspect of this control over my life and over my story, and how I was speaking my own truth, you know, respectfully, but still it was different than I think what he would want people to know. And so I did have to make that choice to cut him out of my life. And so I think I wish that he could know the forgiveness piece, because then I think things could be different. I think we could be in relationship. But yeah, even growing up, there wasn't that freedom to ask questions or to speak my own truth, because if it was different than what his truth was, you know, it wasn't accepted.
So talk a little bit like about that forgiveness and love factor, but still doing it from afar. And what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think, right now I don't have any communication with my dad. So it very much is, I would say, more of like a mindset and action in my own life versus something maybe that he's, I guess, impacted by directly. But I do right now, how I feel like I can love him well is pray for him when I feel like I have the capacity to do that. When I share my story, I really try to do it in like a respectful way and not attacking or anything like that, and really just admitting that none of us are perfect and we all have faults, and I have my own faults. But yeah, I think that's been the primary way I've been able to like love him from afar, is just, you know, pray for him and, hope that he can find the same freedom that I've been able to find in my life.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, or any other questions?
No, I mean, I think what our listeners need to understand is these are not three unique situations. This is probably more of the story of a high percentage of people growing up. And I mean, yes, their families have dysfunction. Nobody's perfect. Well, I'm not claiming that our relationship or our family is perfect by any means. But I'm announcing that I'm at least aware of the things that I need to work on with my children. And I'm just encouraging parents to do the same, become aware of that relationship, and that you have more of a power and a strength to mend that relationship. It's not up to your children to do that. And so I appreciate you guys sharing your stories, because this is what, if I had to put a percentage out there, I bet 80+% of the children, you know, even I didn't say me as a child growing up. I mean, there's a dysfunction, and kind of to piggyback off of Lindsay's story, that's what I had to get to. There's a time I went on Father's Day. I remember, I'll never forget it, because I was going to buy a Father's Day card, and I broke out in tears in the aisle, because every card that I read described the relationship that I wanted to have with my dad, but didn't. And I'm like, who has these relationships? that these Hallmark cards say, say. And I'm like, I don't want it just to be words, in a cute card. I want to actually tangibly have that. But I had to get to the point where I was like, okay, my dad did the best he could. I'm not doubting that. They provided for me. They did the best they could. But he could only get me to this point where I wanted to go higher. So the Bible says that God is the father of the fatherless. And I didn't say I didn't have a father and he was a bad dad, but he could get me to this point, right? But I needed a father to take me to bridge that gap. So I forgave him, like Lindsay had said. I forgave him, released him for all of the whatevers that that there was, and I turned to God to bridge that gap. And I was able to then walk in a different relationship. I had no expectation, but fortunately, my story did end up good. I mean, my dad and I did end up having a great relationship when it was all said and done. And I wish everybody, that was a story for everybody. But the reality is that whether or not we ended up having that, I was at peace, kind of like Lindsay is at peace with her life and moving on and starting to establish legacy in her own life, and is content with with God being that father of the fatherless. So yeah. Even guys have the same stories. Men grow up with the
you're a little outnumbered here. So thank you for that. But Makiah, I also want your thoughts and opinions on that as well, because I know you've had some experiences where you've worked to try to mend that relationship as well. Talk to us about what that was like, what you wish the conversation could have been. Just talk to us about that.
Yeah. And one thing I just feel like is really important to hit on, because I feel like this is a common thread for maybe my generation, or, I just relate to that story of, Eric literally being like, who has this relationship? Like, I want this. And I wish that there were people who could really understand that this generation isn't looking for the same, like, hidden, like, half kind of relationships. I think a lot of us have grown up with seeing even our parents and grandparents' relationships where it's, we hide this when the grandparents come over and we dread this. And, this generation has seen that, and we know that's not what we want. And so I think it's really hard, because some parents might feel like, well, if my kids love me, like, why are they asking to go to counseling? Why are they trying to bring up this stuff? Why can't they just, be happy about it? But it comes from a desire of a true place of, we want healed relationships.
Right.
We don't just want a relationship where we feel like we have to be anything less than who we are. It's not that, even like Lindsay's talking about, sometimes the best way to heal a relationship is to cut it off or to distance, so that healing and true restoration can eventually take place. And that's been, times part of my story. But I just wish that people would understand it's never because there's a hate or there is a wanting to disconnect. It's because we know that we're worth of love in a relationship that's healthy. And I would rather deal with the messy things and love people through that than to put on a fake show and act like everything's okay when it's not. So anyway, that's my little soapbox disclaimer.
No, that's so good. Yeah. I mean, just the fact that it's like, it sounds like out of love, you want to do that stuff. Out of love, you want to go through and journey the healing process, not out of like the hate, like what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So I think this word love is thrown around so loosely. Like, for example, parents would say, oh, I think you love me. Yeah, I know you love me and I love you, but do you like me? Like, what you did hurt me. You need to, if you say you love me, then you need to respect the fact that what you just did was not nice. And we need to work through that. That's what, and I think most people don't, they say love because it's a cute thing to say, but is there really, it's one thing to give love, but if the other person is not receiving that as love, there's a problem. Yeah. There's a disconnect. And parents, I love you. I do this and I do that. Well, there's 5 love languages, right? There's a book called 5 Love Languages. Well, maybe you didn't communicate that love to where your child needs to receive that love, or even in relationships. And so it's just it's thrown out so loosely that we need to we need to really identify and understand what unconditional love is, because Makiah hit it on the head. I mean, without that love, you can't work through those messy things if it's not unconditional. And so many times, parents, you need to realize that you're not communicating love like you think you are, and you really need to get in there and really talk to your son or daughter and work that out.
Yeah. But Makiah, it seemed like you had another thought as well, so I didn't want to cut off that thought.
Yeah. Well, I guess just going back to what you said, like, what do I wish conversations would look like? Because I've definitely been in positions where, I've had my own struggles. And I think we all have things from our childhood, and then there are things that happen when we grow up. And so it can't just be a situation too where you're a victim of, well, my parents didn't love me in this way, or they didn't understand everything, because your parents don't. Like, I'm sure when I have kids, I will not be able to fully understand everything they're going through, because they're going to be different than me. But I think just that those conversations, all I was looking for when I would come to my parents about things was not even the answers. It was just a safe space to be able to feel supported and loved. And I think it's hard too sometimes, because even I say a lot of times, growing up in like a Christian family, there are some like dysfunctional things that we might think are good, just slapping a Bible verse on it, or you just need to pray more, or you should never have that thought because Jesus won't love you if you think that way, or those kind of things can be really damaging and hurtful.
Right.
And they come from this good heart, but that's just where that's kind of, I think if there's anything you can do for a child when they're coming to you with something, acknowledge their bravery, try to be a safe space for them, try to be as little emotionally reactive as possible. But then I think one thing that I've had to learn in my family and my story is there are just some people who, as much as I want them to be that safe space for me, just aren't right now. And that's their own journey. And that doesn't mean that I am not safe or secure. It means that I have been raised to where I can now find those people. I can find the Lindsays and the Kendras and the Madisons who I can talk to. There's been so many mentors in my life who I've been part of their legacy, who aren't my parents. So I think just that idea of, for me, can there be safety as a child?
That's so good. That's so good.
That's what I love about you guys, is that you, in spite of the dysfunction, in spite of the hurts, you guys did not use that as an excuse to play victim for your lives, that you chose to just overcome and continue to move on and seek out those relationships, and find those safe places where you can be who God purposed you to be. So. Yeah.
And we will have to have you guys on again in our religion series to dive a little bit deeper on what Makiah just touched on.
Right.
But to kind of wrap up that area. So what are some of the things you really learned from the dysfunction and the disconnect, and are taking with you that you don't want to implement maybe in your legacy or your family or where you're at now? So Lindsay, you want to start on this one?
Yeah, I would love to. So I think one of the things that I've learned is, and Makiah brought this concept up earlier with curses and blessings. And so I think at first when I learned this, it was overwhelming. I am actually a graduate of Mercy Multiplied, which is where Kendra and I now currently work. And when I was there, we talked a lot about Deuteronomy 30, where it talks about you have the choice set before you of life and death, choose life so that you and your children may live. And it talks about in the Old Testament as well, the concept of, for those that choose to sin and not obey, that there's curses that go to the third and the fourth generation. But the blessings for those that obey go down thousands of generations. And so I think through the dysfunction, I think what I've learned is that it's possible to change that legacy.
Nice.
And if I look back at the third, it was mind blowing when I first learned this, because I actually had a weekend where I was able to, while I was at Mercy, where I was able to spend some time with family, and I learned some about my legacy that I wasn't aware of. And just to keep it really brief, I found out that my great grandpa was in the same group as Al Capone. And he was the one that provided them with alcohol. He made the alcohol during the Prohibition. So I look at the generations, and he was an alcoholic, and there was a lot of violence and anger. With my grandpa, there was alcohol and a lot of violence and anger. And I look at my dad, and there was a lot of alcohol and violence and anger. And so that was a really heavy thing at first. But then I think when I grabbed onto the concept of, oh, but the blessings for the thousands of generations, that's what I really want to do differently. Is I want to focus on not the past. I mean, I feel like I have focused on the past legacy and how to work through that and overcome it, but now the focus has shifted to the future legacy. And whether that's for physical, biological kids someday, or if it is for just the people that I impact in my life, I really want to look at how I can be that stopping point in my generation, in my family line, and start to create that thousands of blessings to come.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good that you came to even that realization of, this is a generational thing. It's going to stop with me. So much power to you, Lindsay, because that's a powerful decision to make. Kendra, what about you? What did you learn from the dysfunction? Where are you at now with how you want to change that and not let it continue?
Yeah, there are some really difficult things that I walked through in my early to late teen years. And those were things that, I found Christ and was set free from. And I learned through, finding Jesus and also therapy, was that those things were not things to be ashamed of. And they were not things to hide under the rug, but they were something that I can share in my testimony, that these were the things that I was saved from. And these were the trials that I walked through, but that I found freedom from. And I've noticed as I, especially, being in church, I would share my testimony, and my parents did not like that. There was this, we want you to share that you have found Christ. We want you to share all the good things, but maybe don't talk about the bad things because those look bad on us. And that would just be something I would really want to pass down. Maybe it's not biological kids, but to any younger people that I'm interacting with, that there is power in your struggles. And, like Lindsay shared, you want to be respectful and not, just attack somebody when you're sharing your story. But there is power in what you are sharing that you have overcome. And I would just really want to not pass that shame down, that struggles they're just a normal part of the human experience. And some struggles are harder than others. But when you get through that, that's something that you want to encourage other people with, and you want to share. And there's no shame in that. So that would be something that I'd really want to empower people with.
It's so good. So good. So well said. Makiah, what about you? I know you've just newly married, possibly thinking about starting a family. What does this legacy look like for you moving forward, where you're at now? And what have you learned from the dysfunction that you're just not really willing to take with you in the future?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that I've learned in my personal journey through a lot of therapy and all these things is just this concept of boundaries. Because I think I was part of our dysfunction was being raised in a family where love meant you can just do anything to anybody and it's okay, And so I think even just that concept of making sure that, we pass on, it's okay for you to speak up with what you need. It is totally okay, to set boundaries with people, because that's how you have healthy relationships. And I think the older I'm getting, the more I'm realizing achievements pass, but relationships are really just instrumental and key. And so I hope that that's something that could be passed on, that your relationship with God's important, that your relationship with people, that, even just in my marriage, praying that is something where we can model that there's actually peace and love, and there can be joy in that. And it doesn't have to just always be a constant battle or fight or tearing the other person down. So, yeah, definitely just hoping that peace and that joy and those strong relationships can be passed down, and we can break cycles of, bitterness and disconnection and dysfunction.
Yeah. Well, I really, really appreciate each of you coming on here and sharing your part of your story and sharing it in a respectful way. And it's just been really, really good. And so one of the questions we ask to kind of wrap up everybody is, what is like one of the greatest lessons you've learned so far, or the best advice that you would give to somebody? And so I know you've all said some great things, but we'll end on this question, and I'll have Lindsay go first.
Yes. Well, I know that Eric touched on this a little bit, but I did want to add to this too, because I would say it is one of the greatest lessons, is the concept of God as Father. Because whether you have a great relationship, a horrible relationship with either your parents or family members, they're never going to be perfect, even if they're the greatest parent in the world. And so whatever that gap is, whether it's a great parent but not perfect, or not a great relationship at all, you still need God as Father. And so I think that has significantly impacted my life since, and it's still a journey. There's still wounds that I'm working through, or lies that I sometimes believe because of how I grew up. But the more that I go back to focusing on God as Father and God as perfect Father and my provider, that's when I feel like then I'm not lacking. Even though I don't have a relationship with my parents now, I'm not lacking because I have God as Father. So wherever you're at on that spectrum, I think that that's a really valuable thing to learn, and will just help you grow in your faith and in hope overall.
Yeah, that's so good. So well said. Kendra, what about you? Greatest lesson or best advice?
Well, I would love to just take what Lindsay said, because that was beautiful. So I guess adding on to that, I would also just encourage people, like, therapy and counseling is such a great resource. And if that is something that you can do, like, please take the time to do it. Even if you're not a person that you feel like, is struggling in an extreme way, like you just have smaller things that you want to work through, or maybe you didn't have that safe space growing up. It's really made an impact for me to know that on 1 hour on Tuesdays, I have a room that is just mine, and I get to say whatever I want, and I get to feel however I am feeling, and I don't have to hide anything. And working through those challenges has just been just so important. So I would absolutely encourage, if there's anybody who's maybe scared, there's such a stigma around therapy that I'm glad that we're kind of dismantling. But it does not mean you're weak. It does not mean that you're crazy, or any terrible stigma that we put on it. But it just means, honestly, that you're strong and that you're willing to face the hard stuff. So that would be an encouragement.
So good. So good. Makiah, what about you?
Yes, well, ditto to both of those things. This was really good. I think one thing that kind of was a mantra in my life when I was really just first starting this healing journey was this idea that I am loved in this moment more than I ever have been and more than I ever will be. And nothing I can do is going to change that, because then that allows me to, when something in a interpersonal relationship is struggling, or I'm having a hard time, or I don't feel as close to God as I like, just that reminder just really brings me a lot of peace in my life. And I think when you can make decisions from a place of knowing that you're already loved and secure, that's just a game changer. So
yeah. Well, thank you again, guys. This has been a really, really good podcast. And I hope that the people who are watching are really receiving what Makiah, Kendra, and Lindsay said, because they said so many great things. And so, yeah, let's go out and build some legacy, but let's do it in a way where we can grow from what we've learned. So, yeah. See, anything else to add, Dad?
No, just thank you all so much. I mean, as you guys have heard, these are three powerful women, and we just appreciate your stories and your intent to overcome and to become all that God has purposed you to be. Keep up your journey. It's you're making a difference in the lives of many people. I can guarantee you that. So thank you for being on and sharing with us.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for allowing us
Thank
to be
you.
on.
Well, until next time, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Legacy Builders.
Yep. See you next time. Thank you guys so much for joining us today on the Legacy Builders podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you are notified when a new episode is posted. Now go out and take your first steps in building your family's legacy.